Friends and colleagues, welcome to the participants and the panelists of this 36th webinar of the series that INHAF, that is Habitat Forum, and some 50 partners are hosting on rethinking city in general and rethinking the Indian city in particular. We started in mid-January, mid-June 2020, and will continue till February next year, doing hopefully over 45 webinars. I'm not sure if we have shared with you with sufficient clarity the purpose behind this webinar series. Let me tell you briefly why we are doing this. The entire effort, which is going on now for last 7 months, is premised on an understanding that whichever way we see it, we as country, we as government, and we as people have much more learning, planning, thinking, organizing, and institutional building to do in order to respond imaginatively to the country's urban challenge. And that is because we do not seem to doing it as well as we could and as well as we must. And be that macro dimensions of the urban challenge, be that infrastructure or governance, land or river, environment or poverty, sustainability or investment resources, now or future. And it's a costly lapse, very expensive situation, whether it is ensuring reasonable living accommodation and safe drinking water to a slum dweller, or the goal of $5 trillion economy in 5 more years. If we underperform on this front, we will compromise on the country's overall future, not only on its urban future. And this is not a figure of speech, this is a statement on an overpowering reality. Even if this analysis is not original or fresh or new, the prescription here probably is. And that is to say that it does not help blaming it on others. And the way to doing it is to internalize it and say what I or we could do and define our own role in search for correctives, alternatives, and better solutions. This particular thought process has two important implications. One, not to blame the government and expect it to do everything. And two, look for ideas, new approaches, solutions, and ways of doing things from people in the academic world, professionals, civil society, business, industry, etc. It does not undervalue or undermine the government's role in managing the urbanization properly and developing cities imaginatively. It explores additional avenues for new ideas, workable solutions, and innovations. And it is based on an assessment that there is considerable expertise, skills, experience, and insight outside the government system that must be harnessed. This webinar series is attempting to open up the much needed societal dialogue on how we handle urbanization processes and develop cities so that they remain engines of economic growth minus the exploitative instinct and damaging traits such as carbon footprint. The goal is to aim for economically productive, socially just, politically participatory, environmentally sustainable, and culturally vibrant cities. also technologically adaptive while being people-centric. And the last thing in this series, we have addressed multiple issues from water to transport to slums to housing to governance, even Gandhi and city. Today's webinar examines resources required for urban infrastructure development and sources and ways to find them. This is a huge challenge. One estimate puts the required resources at $640 billion in coming 20 years. And we know that under JNNURM, one of the previous programs for urban investment, urban infrastructure investment, the country was able to manage something of the order of $14 billion almost in 10 years, and that too stretching the capacity to the limit. The issue of resources and capacity to mobilize and spend money are formidable. We fortunately today have a very competent and experienced group of speakers to discuss the issues that are very important. With that introductory statement on the purpose of the webinar series and what we have been doing for the last 7-8 months, over to Madhav and the panel for next 120 minutes. Thank you very much. Madhav?
Yeah, thank you very much, Kirti Bhai, and it's an honor for us at WRI India to organize this particular session. And it's a very narrow topic on infrastructure finance, where we're really looking at, pooled finance and sector-based pooled finance facilities, and whether that is something that could be considered and explored. Pavan, my colleague, is going to make a background presentation, and then we'll hear from a couple of global examples. One from Emiel Wegelin, who's going to talk about CDIA, and Carlos Mier, who will talk about a specific example from Mexico. And then, we'll have hear other speakers then respond to it going forward. So with that, I will hand it over to Pavan to sort of set the context and move forward in the presentation.
Thanks, Madhav. Thanks, Madhav. Thanks, Kirti Bhai. Maybe I will just take a couple of minutes introducing our panelists, and then I will start maybe I will just give a slight context on the reason why we are having this session and how to take this forward. First, I will briefly introduce our panelists here. Mr. Carlos Mier is the General Coordinator of the Federal Program for Mass Transit. It's a program, and he's been working with government for quite some time, and more than 35 years he spent on the sectors of transport, telecommunication, ports, and merchant navy and other infrastructure. Mr. Carlos has a master's in operation research from LSE and a master's in planning from National University of Mexico. Our second panelist is Dr. Emiel Wegelin. Dr. Emiel Wegelin is the director of UrbAct, the International Advisory Services for Urban Action, based out of Rotterdam. A position he also held during 2001 to 2007. Between 2007 and 2012, Emiel was the GIZ program coordinator for the City Development Initiative Asia, which is based in Manila. Dr. Wegelin actually has over 40 years. He spent with a wide range of international institutions such as IADB, ADB, World Bank, and a lot of these international agencies. He has a PhD in economics from University of Amsterdam. The third panelist is Professor Ashwin Mahalingam. Professor Ashwin Mahalingam is the associate professor at Civil Engineering Department at IIT Madras. Dr. Mahalingam's current research interests include public-private partnerships infrastructure and mega project governance and management. He holds a PhD and a MA in civil engineering from Stanford University, and he also has a BTech from IIT Madras. He is the director at several infrastructure project companies, and he's also involved in setting up the innovation and entrepreneurship ecosystem at IIT Madras. The fourth panelist we have is Ms. K. Lakshmi. She is a senior finance and credit professional. She spent bulk of her career with CRISIL, the India's leading credit rating agency. She held various responsibilities in CRISIL, including the role of head public finance and infrastructure ratings. She is a member of Chartered Accountants of India and Cost and Works Accounts of India. She founded the Macromoney research in 2010. She's been steering the company since the inception. The fifth panelist we have is Mr. Madhav Pai. Madhav is the executive director of WRI Ross Center. He spearheads a large urbanization policy research and prototyping support programs that informs key areas of India's urban growth story. Over last 2 decades, Madhav has led, designed, and implemented some of the well-known urban programs and projects across continents and in over a dozen countries. Under his leadership, the team at WRA and at previously Embark has informed several policy discussions and at the national, state, and city level across sectors like urban transport, transit-oriented development, and regional planning and clean air. Today, WRA Ross Center engages more than 100 professionals in offices across India and supports over 50 cities in India. So he's a civil engineer from Mumbai and holds a master's in transport planning from University of California, Berkeley. So we thank all the panelists for making time to speak with us. Now I will set the context for this session. Just give me a minute, I will share the presentation. Okay, can you see my screen now?
Yes, Pavan.
Yeah, okay. It's okay.
Okay, great. So as Kirti Bhai said, looking at the amount of the urban infrastructure investments, one estimate, high-powered expert committee on urban infrastructure puts the estimate at $650 billion, whereas the McKinsey estimate puts it at $1.2 billion. On a per capita investment terms, the cities would have to spend anywhere between $750 to $1,000 just to finance the urban infrastructure requirement. Additional $330 billion is required to manage the urban infrastructure over the next 20, 25 years. But if you just look at the broad category of the sectors that we have, almost 50 to 55% actually goes into urban roads and urban transport. The bulk of investments actually goes into. So word of caution here is that while these numbers look pretty large, in fact, the estimates are likely to be an underestimate because the land cost and as well as the cost escalation, which would basically occur at the DPR and the implementation level, are not part of these investments. To that extent, they are. It kind of gives you the magnitude of urban infrastructure requirements that are required to finance over the next 20 to 25 years. So how do you look at the planning and phasing of these investments? So given the long gestation periods of infra projects, any investment in urban infrastructure needs to consider not just the immediate requirements, but also the long-term investment plan to meet the desired service level standard. So the phasing plan, which I have shown here, largely being prepared based on the 12th five-year plan working group report. If you look at the first three, the blue line largely depicts the phasing plan which was proposed as part of the high-powered expert committee, which takes a very conservative approach because given the kind of capacity constraints that we have at the ULB level and the absorbing capacity of the city, that kind of takes a very slightly conservative approach. Whereas the remaining two approaches, which basically being proposed by 12th five-year plan working group, takes a more aggressive approach. But the fact that you have to spend most of the money in water, sewer, and transport because the economic benefit that would accrue to the entire system would be much larger than what you would otherwise once you spend pretty little money on that one. If you look at that yellow line, which is basically the capital expenditure that actually happened since 2013, in a way, it actually resonates with the phasing of the investment proposed as part of scenario one, which is basically the covering the backlogs which of the infrastructure in water, transport, and sewerages within the over next 15 years, and also doing the incremental infrastructure that is required to meet the incremental population. That's how one should look at it. So the point here is, whichever way you look at it, the amount of investment that would require to finance urban infrastructure are pretty large. So now look at how cities are financing now. If you look at how cities are financing right now, the patterns kind of suggest that the cities are now mostly depending on intergovernment transfers, especially after since 2017 when with the introduction of GST. Some of the taxes have been subsumed under GST. Some of these taxes which were earlier with urban local bodies now have been subsumed under GST. Because of that, there is some kind of devolution, more devolution that is happening on the state and central. So in a way, cities more or less are depending on this fiscal framework that's coming from intergovernment transfers to kind of finance mostly the revenue expenditure and as well as some of the capital expenditure. There has been some amount in terms of municipal borrowing that has happened, but it's mostly from the scheduled commercial banks and as well as some institutions like HUDCO. But when you look at the data that's being collected by the Finance Commission, if you just take those words by it, then there is some kind of surplus that is available to finance the capital expenditure. But once you adjust the revenue expenditure to the HPEC norms, then there is not much left to finance the capital expenditure. If you just look at it, if you just go with the numbers that they have, the cities, mostly the JNURFT, which are 55 cities, actually have about $14 billion if you just consider 20 times the revenue surplus as the, to raise the resources. You could do some $14 billion of investment. But once you readjust for HPEC norms, cities actually have a deficit of $1.3 billion. That's the point that I'm trying to say. Mostly most of the cities actually spend grossly underspend on the O&M. So if you have to kind of manage and mitigate some of the infrastructure costs, probably you have to maintain your assets much better with the kind of with the required levels of O&M expenditure. That's it. So in terms of financing framework, so just to understand what is the magnitude of the unfunded deficits, I just use the financing framework. You first take the entire total revenue of the municipal bodies, and then you deduct the total revenue expenditure as well as whatever the annuity payments that are on the debt payment that would be there. You get some investable surplus, okay? And then you take the investable surplus and then see how much capital investment is required, and then you get the gross deficit that would have to be met by some of the instruments like PPP, annuity, borrowing, and land-based instruments. Once you kind of exhaust these instruments like PPP, annuity, and borrowing, and some of these land-based instruments, only then the government of India should actually kind of use their federal funding to kind of fund this unfunded deficit. In a way, it's a gap. So whenever you are looking at the federal funding, funding mechanism, you have to look at it as gap funding exercise rather than using it as a first source of revenue to finance the urban infrastructure. That's the point. That's the point that I'm trying. So based on this financing framework, if you look at the deficit surplus for the capital infra, it's pretty large. So we are looking at something like $15 billion to $15 billion to almost $50 billion over next 15 to 20 years. And so the only way to kind of meet all these requirements is that you have to kind of have access to capital markets and as well as use judiciously whatever the revenue that you have to kind of leverage and then get the money from the capital market. So even with the the smart cities, the investment requirement put by these smart cities, they're talking about something $30 billion in terms of the requirement. And they also proposed that only 8% of those capital expenditure would be met by the own revenue. So almost 40% of the capital expenditure would have to be met by either PPPs or other means such as municipal borrowing and some of these. But looking at the case of JNURM, only 2% of the capital expenditure has been funded by these PPPs. So only about 1,200 crores. That's about money that came from PPP projects. That too about within the 50 projects. The working group puts it across, says that if you have to kind of meet 20% of capex through PPP, then at least you have to have at least 250 to 300 PPP projects per every year. You have to prepare all the DPRs, all the project preparation would have to happen for at least for 250 to 300 projects. Even to have some kind of these 250 to 300 projects, getting ready for implementation, at least you have to have 600 to 800 projects under pipeline, which means you have to prepare some kind of feasibility report, you have to prepare some kind of DPR, and then get it vetted by experts, and then you have to be ready with them as and when the money is available. So, which means there is a huge demand and huge, there is a huge problem, huge, some kind of opportunity to create some kind of mechanism wherein we beat the project preparation and the development, development facility. That's the other point. So what's happening with the municipal borrowing in India?
Pavan, just quickly, just move to the questions, I think, and then we can, that's, yeah.
Yeah, so, I will just spend a minute here.
Yeah, just very quickly.
Yeah, sure. So what we are proposing here is that looking at some of the experience from JNURM and the TNUDF like structures, pooled finance works better when the amount of money for each of the projects is very, very low. See, a typical water supply project costs you around $85 million in a city like, with a population of $1 billion. But the transaction cost just to prepare and the development cost will be pretty, kind of undermines the ability to finance, from these smaller municipalities. So what makes the case for to create a sector-based pooled finance mechanism with the project development facility is that you can bundle these projects and then prepare some kind of report wherein you can go to the market and get the money. So to meet whatever the requirement that you have, so you have to kind of prepare these 250 to 300 projects every year. But at a state level, you would have probably 15 to 20 cities preparing at any given point of time. So it doesn't really make sense to kind of have a project preparation facility at the state level. Probably it actually makes sense to have a project preparation facility at the national level. Probably, so that's the way to look at it. So the question that we have for this session is that, is there a merit to create a sector-based pooled finance? For example, for the transport is one, for water and sanitation other one. So with what is the appropriate framework that one should look at it? And second is, what kind of design, how do you design that facility so that the projects are bankable and also the market worthy? So third question is, so what should be the institutional structure of the fund? So is it feasible to have at the central level with both the project preparation facility as well as the fund facility, or you unbundle these two things, say the project preparation facility you can have at the central level, but the fund facility you can have at the state level. So those are the questions that we have in our mind. So those are the questions that we thought we would just discuss during this session, and then see if there is a way to kind of take that discussion forward. Madhav, over to you, maybe.
So I think, thank you, Pavan, for the introduction. So now let's have Carlos share the experience of ProTrump first. So Carlos, over to you. Do you want us to run your presentation, or do you?
Yes, yes, I think I'll just tell you how to change the slides. If you can bring the presentation up.
Pavan, you want to do that? Yeah, okay. But Radhika is doing it. Okay, great.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I hope I can share some useful experience here from Mexico. Go on to the next one. I want just to explain you what the context of the financial situation of Mexico. We have a development bank called Banco Nacional de Obras y Servicios Públicos, Banobras. It's the main development bank of Mexico, and it's focused mainly in three aspects. As development bank, about 70% of the borrowing is orientated to the states and municipality governments to give them loans, guarantees, and technical assistance for mainly state infrastructure and municipality infrastructure. And about 30% of the borrowing is orientated, and it's growing, to project finance. It is like a big infrastructure projects. And as Banobras, we offer the concessionaries, loans, guarantees, and technical assistance also. And on the other side, as a fiduciary or trustee, we are the trustee as Banobras from the National Fund of Infrastructure, where there is another way of giving grants, mezzanine credits, guarantees, and technical assistance to PPP projects. Let's go to the next one. And the National Infrastructure Fund is where the PROTRAM program is to support sustainable transport projects. And it's a structure as a concessionary of 4,415 kilometers of toll roads. So these toll roads are the federal toll road network, is the patrimony of the national infrastructure, and its orientated, its goals and purposes is to operate the road network, to serve the debt acquired to develop this network, and also if there's a surplus which can arise to the surplus of the toll roads, these toll roads is used to finance other infrastructure projects. It's additional to the federal budget, and it's orientated to complement the budget of the states and municipalities to develop other infrastructure projects, which have to be high social return with cost benefit analysis, and are orientated to complement the projects with grants or guarantees to make the projects financially viable in order to become a PPP projects with private investment participation. During the last 12 years, we have supported about 110 projects. It's about $10,000 million of federal support, and it induces the total investment of $30,000 million. Next. These are the programs where the National Fund projects is orientated. Mainly about 70% to 80% of the projects are new toll roads. But also with the surplus, we have developed this public transport program to give federal support to the states and the municipalities. So there's the sustainable transport program. We also give support to water supply or water sewage. It's the PROMAGUA program. And also we have been developing a program to support solid waste management, which is a big problem in our main cities. And also we give support to create a market of private investment funds. So we participate with about 20% of the capital of these funds to induce a market where the private companies invest in infrastructure, public infrastructure projects. And we don't have a special program, but we support other type of projects like urban development, railroads, ports, and also renewable energy projects. Next, please. This is, I want to show you the urban context of Mexico. We are a federal republic, and we have about 2 million square kilometers and about 120, almost 130 million inhabitants. And the subnational governs are 32 states and 2,457 municipalities. The revenues of these states, mainly they come from the federal participation in the overall value-added taxes and revenue taxes, which are captured in a coordination fund, which from that the federal government distributes these taxes to the states and the municipalities. But as we saw in the previous presentation, there's not enough surplus revenue to invest in infrastructure. So the National Fund Infrastructure is helping to induce more PPP projects, given part of the investment with federal funds that arrive from the surplus of the toll roads network. Our population is growing very fast, 1.3%, as in most of the countries of the world. We have the population is concentrated in large cities. We have already 37 large cities, where almost more than 50% of the population is living in these big cities. We call it big cities with more than 500 inhabitants. And we have a lot of small cities dispersed all over the country with less than 5,000 inhabitants. And the urban transport problem is concentrated mainly in the big cities. Therefore, let's see the next slide. This is the situation, how the urbanization is growing in Mexico. In the 14 big cities of more than 1 million inhabitants, since 1980, the population has almost doubled, but the urban area has expanded 5 times. So we have cities very spread with and not very compact. And in the next size of cities, between 500 and 1 million, the situation is worse in the expansion. The population has more than doubled, but the area has expanded 7 times. So the urban challenge is greater with this type of urbanization. Let's go to the next slide. So that's our cities are becoming, they need a sustainable development, and the urban transport problem is affecting their competitiveness and the quality of life, with the increasing time of travel, the congestion, the contamination, which is happening also in India and most of our developing countries. We are also affecting the climate change, and we have very inefficient use of energy. Therefore, with these reasons, inefficient and unsustainable public transport, we had decided to create this through the Secretary of Hacienda. They decided to create this federal program to help the subnational governments to promote sustainable transport development. Let's go to the next slide. So therefore, we formed this federal transit program about 12 years ago, with 2 main objectives: to give financial support to the governments, or the subnational governments, to implement urban and suburban transit projects, mainly in partnership with subnational governments and private investors. We ask mainly that about 50% of the investment should be subnational government, and so that the federal support goes up to 50% of the public investment, and we try to promote at least 34% of private investment in the projects. And the other objective is to give technical assistance to the local agencies to build institutional capacity. With these objectives, let's go to the next slide. We are addressing this problem, which is happening in most of our countries. I won't stop very much here, because You have a similar problem that we have in Mexico with the deficient urban transport planning. The authorities are weak with limited resources. The legal framework is outdated. We have a big informal operators with small vehicles and very old and with not enough, not well planning in the routes. The bus fleet is antiquated and highly polluted. We have not introduced enough technology with ITS, and the fares have to be low because they have to be accessible to population. So there's poor credit access. Therefore, we need to support this subnational governance with federal aid. Let's go to the next one, please. Therefore, the program, the federal program for transit, has two branches to give support to the states. Through grants through the national infrastructure front, we have grants up to 50% of the public investment, and also grants to the studies in order to build capacity. We give grants to build the sustainable program of urban transport, and also to develop the feasibility studies. The subnational governments have to put about 50% in order to be engaged in the project, and we give up to 50% for the investment now in the real investment in the infrastructure, and we also give other types of guarantees for the commercial banks and the developed banks to make it bankable, the project. And through Banobras, these instruments where they give technical assistance directly to the subnational governments, and they give loans to the subnational governments so that they can provide their local participation. And also Banobras gives loans to the private operators. Therefore, we have already 29 projects which are already in operation with this program. There are 20 bus systems and five train systems. Let's go to the next one. I will try to. This is the approach which you must be. We need to have a. There are the three first points are some requisites that we ask them. They have to have a sustainable plan as a requisite to give them this federal assistance to the projects. They have to have a transport authority that will be in charge of the project, and the companies, they have to be developed, transform as companies, not as an informal sector. And the approaches, there are issues there that you must apply also in your programs. And the idea is to have it in an integral planning, linking transportation to road network and urban development. And with this approach and strategy, next slide, please. We ask the subnational governments to have, as I told you, this the integral plan of sustainable transport, a legal framework, a local transit authorities organization, and in order to give them, they have to develop a integral feasibility study, technical, environmental, and social, a cost-benefit analysis, a PP financial structure, so that we can assure that the project is financially viable, and they have to bring private investment at least with 34% of the total investment. And next slide. With this approach, we structure the projects in these 4 components of this infrastructure. You have to have dedicated infrastructure. That's where the public investment is mainly, and where the federal support is given, and also the infrastructure facilities as the station and terminals, which can be with private investment or combined public and private. The buses are mainly private, or buses or trains, and we force them to introduce technology like traffic signaling, the fare collection. So with these 4 components, we help them with financing their studies to develop the integral feasibility projects and to invest in the infrastructure. Let's go to the next one, please. The next slide, please. So in this, this is mainly the approach, as I told you. The infrastructure is, and this is the cycle. We go to these 5 phases: the feasibility studies with the preparation, the authorization, the implementation, and the monitor, operation, construction, and operation. And in the first stages, we give them financial support, and the next stages, we also try to monitor and to give them to, so that they, because sometimes the most difficult part is the implementation after you have prepared the feasibility study. So with this approach, let's go to the next one. Here's the pipeline or of the projects. You can see if we haven't introduced this financial support with the program, with the PROTRAM, the tendency will be very slow in order to be developing sustainable transport projects. We have in this table, you can see that we have already 34 bus systems in different cities. We have reached already about 20 cities of the 34 cities with more than 500 inhabitants. We have we've been working also in rail systems. We have already 5 in construction or in operation with support. And this is helping the subnational governments to go in the right direction to transform their transport systems in sustainable transport systems. Let's go to the next one. In the next slide, I think I have it's just the last slide so that you can see that we are in almost in all the states and municipalities. That's all, and we can go deeper, but that's what we have achieved, and we are going to stress this program in the different governments. Thank you very much. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Carlos. Now we will turn to Emiel. He would be discussing on the development.
Yeah, we missed you for a moment.
Oh, sorry. No, now we will turn to Emiel. He is going to speak about the City Development Initiative Asia, which is one of the project development facilities. It was created by some of the multilateral and bilateral agencies. Emiel, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here in this webinar, talking about the Cities Development Initiative for Asia, of which I was the program coordinator from October 2007 until the end of 2012, when I returned home to the Netherlands. After that, I was, as you said, I was the director of UrbAct for a few years until my retirement in 2016. So my presentation is mainly about the CDIA story during the time when I was the program coordinator. I have kept abreast with the program. It's still running. So my last slide will also show a little bit about the present status. So here we go. Now I need to get back to the start. Yep. Okay, so this is the opening slides, and that gives me the opportunity to talk a little bit about the subject, how CDIA came to pass. I have to take you back to 2006, when the Asian Development Bank, together with the GDZ, the German Development Cooperation Agency, organized a major conference in Manila in the Philippines on urban Asia and emerging issues, with about 100 mayors and other leaders from the Asian Development Bank's developing member countries, including India, of course. Many issues were discussed in that conference. Many constraints were identified, and the CDIA was set up to address one of these. So let me talk a little bit about CDIA's rationale. One of the gaps that was identified is this one. Cities do have strategies and spatial plans, but often they're not linked and not adequately defined. And why is that? Historically, many of the countries that we're talking about had a strong national sectoral ministry defining projects and pipelining those. For instance, in Indonesia, the Ministry of Public Works has been doing that for decades and was very strong. But then with the onset of decentralization in many of the countries, the link between project development and the national government was basically cut, and cities were left by themselves. In the conference, it was noted that this was a particular issue for what we call medium-sized cities in Asia, which were defined somewhat similar to what we heard of Mexico just now, of a population of 250,000 to 5 million. And the logic being, and whether this is right or wrong with hindsight is a difficult question to answer. The logic being that it was felt that the larger cities, that is over 5 million, had adequate resources themselves to deal with bridging this gap. The smaller ones were perceived not having very, very serious problems. So therefore, the focus was on the medium-sized cities. That's what the CDIA started to address. Now, that sort of makes it clear that it's hard to address the regular feasibility study instruments for these purposes. There had to be something else in between, and that then led to the emergence of the initiative called CDIA, Cities Development Initiative for Asia, to put in place a preparatory facility that would focus on the stages before the pre-feasibility stage.
Yeah.
So this I've covered. It gives you a bit of an idea of the technical assistance resources that we had during the years that I was program coordinator and immediately thereafter. We were focusing on infrastructure, municipal infrastructure by and large, but emphasizing also some of the objectives of urban environmental improvement, urban poverty reduction, climate change, mitigation, adaptation, and improved governance. Now, in terms of the actual activities, basically, there were 4 areas that we focused on, and which local governments could request assistance on. That was the preparation of infrastructure investment plans and programs, pre-feasibilities, linking cities to finance, and capacity development for those purposes. I'd like to emphasize here that the approach that CDA took was a demand-driven approach. That is to say, the cities or district local governments, depending on, had to apply for CDA support. And needless to say, they could not do that in a vacuum. They had to do this backed up by an expression of support from national or provincial government, depending on the situation in the countries. But basically, the logic here was that we should not, as CDA, predetermine what a city would need, but rather respond to a request for assistance from the city leadership. So let me talk a little bit to the project cycle as we perceived it at the time. Here on the left hand, you see the city development plans or strategies. All the cities that we worked with had some measure of a spatial development framework. On the right-hand side, you see the traditional project cycle starting with a feasibility study, then sort of working on financing arrangements through project implementation and operation and maintenance. So what was lacking were the areas on which the CDA focused, and that is planning and programming for infrastructure investment over a medium-term horizon, mostly 5, sometimes 6, 7 years, and within that, prioritized scoping projects for scoping studies for projects, i.e. pre-feasibility studies. So that's the mandate on which CDA started to work on. Notwithstanding that, there was lots of pressure for us to also get ourselves involved in developing the spatial framework, which we by and large resisted. Likewise, there was also pressure to go downstream and sort of pick up work that perhaps we did a pre-feasibility study on, also in the further development in the feasibility. Again, where we could, we tried to avoid that. So the central area here were the areas in which we supported directly. But it was very clear that apart from that there was a need to also work on strengthening the capacity of the city governments itself to be at least a good client to CDIA as a minimum requirement. This is a little bit about the implementation status at the time when I left the program, shortly before the end of 2012. Gives you an idea of the number of cities we covered at that time and the type of activities that we covered. The preponderance was pre-feasibility studies, more so than the planning and programming for infrastructure in the cities. We also estimated at that time what it would mean in terms of the investment, that the physical investment that would go into the cities with the projects that we had identified at the pre-feasibility level. And you see at that time, it was about 6.5 billion in the cities in which we worked, so 48 cities at that time. And we also estimated that the actual inputs that we put in was only about 0.25% of the estimated capital investment. Sources of investment at that time, and it's a bit different now, I'll come to that later, mainly Asian Development Bank, some KfW, and some very limited PPP. Now, here it is important to mention that the timeline of all of this is quite extraordinary, because from the first idea of an intervention, or shall we say a draft application for support from CDA, until the point of time when you would have brought the pre-feasibility study to a financial institution and agreed basically to take it further, would, under the best of circumstances, take 3 to 4 years. So by the time we were in November 2012, the program had just run for a little more than 5 years, you could see that the numbers were not really that great yet. This was the picture at the time, the cities in which we had worked and where there had been some ongoing work or completed work. This gives you an idea of the type of areas in which we work in. I don't think this will surprise you very much. Obviously, urban transport was a major concern, followed by flood and drainage management, urban renewal, water supply, solid waste management. Then there were some smaller areas. Now, when we looked ahead to the future then, we sort of asked ourselves the question, is this logical? Is it sufficient? Should we do things a little bit differently? And here is, again, the same slides the slide that I showed you earlier. So what to do with the gap in the middle? Should we continue just working on the investment planning and programming and prioritizing projects for pre-feasibility study, or was there more to it? And it will come as no surprise that we found that it was not good enough. These were the original 2 blocks that we worked on. But then we decided that the linking projects to financing in itself was a major undertaking that required technical assistance resources to devote to. So we identified it as a separate activity. And likewise, the capacity gap and capacity building to overcome that was identified as a major other area for attention. This is the final slide, and it gives you an idea of where CDA stands today. After I left in the end of 2012, it continued with support from the Asian Development Bank and a number of bilateral donor institutions. And as of the middle of the year, you'll see CDA commissioned project preparation studies in 112 cities in more than 20 developing member countries, including pre-feasibility studies, prioritized investment programs in 88 cities linked to downstream financing, estimated by the middle of this year at capital funding of around 11.2 billion. So that's the story in as far as the developing Asia continent is concerned. India, of course, was a country of major concern for us at CDA, a major client. And if you now look back at what has come about, you find that relatively we couldn't do a great deal of work in India. All in all, out of these interventions, only 10 cities in India were covered. Now, why was that so? In spite of the fact that there was JNNURM, one of these interventions was eventually picked up by JNNURM funded. Some were ADB, as you could expect. Some were KfW. not much by way of PPP. Local development banks played a role, but that's it. All in all, I think it is fair to say that the overall institutional environment was not sufficiently favorable to make use of this instrument that CDA really was in a very effective way. So if I look back now after 8 years, I can simply say the logic of this approach is as relevant as it was during the time I was program coordinator, but it has not been utilized sufficiently, certainly not in India. So let me end there and come back to further points in the discussion. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Emiel. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. Now I turn to Ashwin. Ashwin, you have closely followed the UNITI program. I would request you to speak about some of the key aspects of that water and sanitation pool fund that may have had led to its success, and the importance of project preparation and the use of PPPs under this framework to just get the projects get done. Could you please?
Sure. Thanks, Pavan, and thank you all for the invitation to be a part of this panel. I think the project Pavan was referring to is something that happened in Tamil Nadu, I guess, more than a decade ago now, and was premised on the same set of ideas that I think Pavan made in his, in the introductory presentation, which is that many urban local bodies, particularly in tier 2 cities and so on, just do not have the capability of financing very necessary infrastructure projects, primarily because, Pavan, in your words, there is hardly any investable surplus. And their balance sheets are in such condition that if they went out to markets to borrow, then the rates at which they would borrow would be very high for them to service as a result of these projects. And so they're in a bit of a catch-22 situation. And as in many other parts of the world, they're dependent on grants from elsewhere, etc. And so the intervention here was that there's a new organization that was created called the Tamil Nadu Urban Development Fund, which essentially did again a little bit of what Pavan said earlier, which is tried to pool together a number of projects from various urban local bodies, and this was actually a sector-specific effort on water. So there were, I think, in the initial conceptualization, about 13 urban local bodies who had projects that were pooled together, and then Tamil Nadu Urban Development Fund went in and raised money for those projects. So again, Pavan made the point of urban local bodies engaging in very high transaction costs as they try to raise funds, and this was one way of minimizing those transaction costs, because you have one agency that's sort of raising in a pooled manner across ULBs, and therefore the transaction cost gets aggregated and therefore minimized. But also because of the pooled nature of the instrument, you also had interest rates coming down. And I think, if I recall correctly, by themselves, the ULBs would have borrowed at somewhere in the 12 to 13% range. With this fund, they were able to borrow at about 9.2%, if I recall, correctly. And so you had this mechanism where, lenders lent to TNUDF then on lent to various urban local bodies for them to actually complete projects in the water supply and sanitation sector. And indeed, a number of projects did get completed. But if you look under the hood a little bit and sort of try to understand what really happened, it was reasonably successful, in my opinion. If you start looking at why it was successful, I think there are a few critical factors, right? First is, setting up of an organization like TNUDF itself, right, which is which requires some effort in terms of institutional creation, institutional design. So it doesn't happen overnight, right? And all of the the organizations that Carlos was talking about, Emiel was talking about, all of these don't come up overnight. So there's quite a bit of effort that, particularly in this case, state governments need to undertake. But even after that, there were a number of safeguards that were put in place to build investor confidence and get that AA rating, right? Which I think it was AA rating that these bonds were finally rated at, right, for them to actually be able to attract capital. So there was some kind of an escrow arrangement that was created, and therefore all of the ULBs would then park some of their revenues in escrow. There was something called a debt service, recourse fund that was created, again to safeguard the ability to pay back the loans that were taken. There were guarantees that were given by the government of Tamil Nadu, and I believe in this case there's also a guarantee given by USAID, partial guarantee to a certain amount of capital. So a lot of guarantees were given, these escrow structures, these debt service, recourse structures. So all of these contributed to the fact that there was enough investor confidence to lend to all of these ULBs. And again, I think we've got to understand that. Therefore, there is quite a bit of effort that needs to be put in at the state level to set up all of these structures for the plan to succeed. On the other side, it's also very important, and it was very important to find good investments, right, which could actually make a reasonable amount of return. And therefore, in this case, I think the projects that the money went into were actually projects that were, either about to start construction or perhaps even in the process of construction. So projects that had been considerably de-risked. There were no issues with regards to land, with regards to stakeholder protests and those kinds of things, right? So again, it was very important to find these kinds of projects for the plan for the whole, program to be quite successful. So again, when you take sort of that lesson on, just going back to what Emiel was saying, there is this big gap between all these city development plans, etc., and having what in India we like to call a shelf of bankable projects, right? That money can directly go into, which have been de-risked because the studies have already been done. Some of the permissions and approvals and environmental clearances and all of that have been obtained. And so there's quite a bit of work that I think needs to go on behind the scenes for cities to be able to receive these kinds of pooled finance instruments. So I think the pooled financing concept, I think it is a good concept. It worked really reasonably well in Tamil Nadu, but there's all this background work that happened, behind. And I think one of the big gaps, and again, Emiel was pointing out, is that whole project development process is often hurried. We rush through, we prepare, again, in the Indian parlance, these DPRs, detailed project reports, often are prepared at very, very short notice. And as a result of which, you probably don't have the optimal technical, contractual, financial structure that will give confidence to investors/lenders, but also provide structures where the projects can ultimately the projects need to generate some amount of revenue for all of this to work, right? And so unless you can figure that out, and so sometimes that might involve things like tariff reform that needs to come in so that you actually have a viable bankable project that that can then repay the debt that you take. But tariff reform is not trivial, right? There's quite a bit of consultation, legislation that needs to go into it. So I think there's a lot of background work that that state governments or municipal governments need to do. Municipal governments may not necessarily be as well placed because of generally relative lack of capacity compared to state governments. But that, I think, is a very critical issue that needs to be resolved for these kinds of mechanisms to function. But if you can bring in, prepare early and have this sort of shelf of bankable projects ready, then I think all of this becomes feasible. And I think one of the things that I personally advocate is that one of the reasons we run into trouble in India and elsewhere is that our frameworks are very rigid. And unfortunately, the future is not predictable. And therefore, what ends up happening is that you have a project assumption in terms of the cost of the project, the kind of revenues that you will get. But then you run into a situation like COVID-19, where all of your calculations go for a toss. You need to have enough flexibility in your contractual framework in order to be able to reset and re-baseline what you're doing, so that maybe a little bit later than expected, those expected revenues still come in and they go back to the lender, etc. So I think if we start introducing a little bit more of first, if we start preparing earlier, so we have our shelf of project reports prepared, and we start introducing more flexible contractual mechanisms, I don't see why pooled financing mechanisms cannot really be part of the larger urban financing solution landscape. Right. So I'll stop here and maybe we can come back for questions, discussion.
Oh, just, I want to ask a follow-up. Ashwin, just a little more thought. So, I think it's very clear from what Carlos shared and what Emiel shared, what you've been talking, that both project preparation facilities and pooled finance seem to be actually quite good, right? And given the fact that we have such a big gap, why do you think that even those little experiments of TNUDF or KUIDFC, nothing, this hasn't really proliferated, or we aren't seeing, do you think it's the level, do you think that this, whether it's at state or national, I mean, just curious, and any thoughts on how that could get a big sort of push then in.
Yeah, I think that's a $1 million question, Madhav, and I won't pretend that I know exactly the answer to that question. In fact, this was something I was looking at yesterday in preparation to this talk. A couple of things I think sort of came up. One is, I think there was a report on the web that sort of talked about the organizational stability, saying that unfortunately key people who are really who had built up the organization left, and therefore the organization could not sustain in terms of going out with the next round of financing, etc. But also, I think what happened was that at that time there were a series of projects that were sort of relatively ready for the picking, if you were, for this kind of an instrument, and they were sort of cherry picked and put into this package, and therefore it worked. But unlike fruits that go on trees, you don't just automatically get these ripe cherries that you can pick. There's a lot of effort that goes on in the background, and replicating that, I think, has been been bit of a challenge. And partly, I think it's also because we talk about cities, but cities in India and in many parts of the world, but specifically in India, are not in control of their infrastructure future, because there's just so much fragmentation in terms of service delivery. There's a separate water department, there's a separate electricity department. We know all of this, right? Roads, etc. So this fragmentation makes it even more difficult, that unless you really have a focus in mind and a slightly long-term view and start preparing towards it, you can't put the cart before the horse and say, let me create this instrument, raise funds, and automatically we'll have projects. So I think that's sort of what's missing. The fragmentation, I think, creates challenges. And that's where I think something that I think, Madhav, you said, or Pavan said at the beginning, looking at a sector-specific fund makes more sense in the Indian context, because you're not cutting through those kinds of lines. So maybe not a very direct answer, but those are some of the thoughts I have on that question.
Thank you, Ashwin. Thank you.
Thanks, Madhav. Thank you, Ashwin, for that wonderful. Madhav, I will come to you. Basically, I just want to, want you to kind of, because you have seen that a lot of attention has been during the JNURM, is that the project planning and the quality of DPR. Given the your experience in lot of these urban transport projects, especially and some of these. What do you think are some of these pertinent issues in the project preparatory activities and as well as developmental that basically impeded the leveraging of this public finance to attract the market capital? Could you please share that?
Lakshmi, you're muted, huh? So, you're muted, Lakshmi. So.
Hello.
Yeah, now we can hear you. Yeah.
Yeah. So I can't hear Pavan. Could you just request?
Pavan, you're going
Hello.
in and out. So if you can, yeah.
Yeah. Just is it audible?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Like we said, basically, just want to understand from you, if you look at, from the creditworthiness perspective, what are the key parameters one would look at while evaluating projects like this for the, whether they are bankable or not? That's one. Second is, what do you think, is there a merit kind of creating, so rather than pooling different sectors into, as sectoral projects into one pool, is there a merit kind of you create one pool with the similar projects from the similar sector? We just want to understand from the credit rating perspective on the project.
Okay, got it broadly. See, when we do credit rating, we look at the particular project that is being financed, and in pool finance mechanisms, it is a lot of small urban local bodies coming together. And in the two projects that we did, the Karnataka Water and Sanitation Funds, as well as the Tamil Nadu Water and Sanitation Funds, there was a pooling of municipalities which had water and sewerage issues. And they came together and a pool fund was formed, and then the PTCs were issued. So we went into the underlying municipalities and this project, and what is the merit of this project, and the beneficiaries of the project, the cost of it, and also looked hugely at the enhancement, because the standalone profile of these municipalities wasn't great. They're very small municipalities. So there were very many layers of credit enhancement in these funds. So you had sort of an escrow mechanism where the interest payments were being put up front, and there was a bond service fund which had a percentage of the principal repayment put into it. And then you had the state government intervention, where the state government said that the SFC devolutions would be sort of taken and used for the payment if there is any default. And then you had US aid giving a sort of guarantee for 50% of the principal. So there were many layers of the credit enhancement. And in these pool fund structures, these credit enhancements become very important. And also the overall creditworthiness of the state government itself, because any law that the state government passes can have an impact on the revenues of the municipalities. And so the level of the state government support and the powers the state government has makes it so critical to the entire rating. So the rating view is also taken on the state government that supports the structure, that is the parent of the structure. And with all these credit enhancements, the rates achieved were between AA and AAA, and these are called structured obligations because the ratings depend on the structures that you have put in. And both these the pool funds that were done, both Karnataka and Tamil Nadu, were a good success. Tamil Nadu more so, and a lot more preparation had gone into it, and there were about 6 series of issues that happened, and they were pretty successful. And Karnataka had one issue of 100 crores and did not come back into the market. Not just the sanitation and pool funds, it's not just the pool funds mechanism, the entire municipal bonds market took sort of a backstage when this flagship scheme JNURN came, because that vision sort of giving grants to municipality them self-reliant. So nobody had an incentive to go into the market, and that to be such complex structures, because you must understand, to have these sort of complex structures, you need a state government that is very, very prepared. And with this credit rating analysts and intellectuals and multilateral agencies working with them, Tamil Nadu had always been ahead in terms of municipal reforms, particularly accounting reforms, bookkeeping. So it was always ahead, and Karnataka was always a very well-governed state. And so those states had this place. I know Telangana government would like to go for a pooled finance scheme, but the municipalities are weak, and the level of preparation that is required to create this kind of a pool is enormous. So the entire municipal bonds market sort of went to sleep until 3 years ago when SEBI came out with a fresh set of guidelines. And after that, you have seen some municipalities sprinting. In fact, they have been received with red carpet in the bond markets. Even recently, Lucknow municipal bond was oversubscribed 4.5 times. Almost every bond has been oversubscribed. So to the other question that, is the market big enough to receive these municipal bonds? If you go by the reception that these bonds have been getting, yes, because many of them have got 2 times, 4.5 times, 6 times oversubscription, that it almost seems criminal to turn down the extra money instead of keeping it as a green shoe option. So they have been very well received, and it's only a matter of time before the pool funds also come. But it is my humble opinion that none of these bonds markets can really take off unless you build a retail interest in it. If you notice the Tamil Nadu Water and Sanitation Pool Fund, at least one of the funds was used to retire the high cost loans that had been taken by these municipalities. Now, if you're going to approach the retail market, it is very good to take the project risk of it. If it is going to be a refinancing of bond, then there would be greater interest among the retail investors, because you do not put the project risk on them. The project has already been covered and it's a refinancing thing. That could be one of the reasons why that particular tranche was so successful. So there is a market for these pool funds as well as the bond funds. And the steps that are required by the state government, by these municipal bodies, is first of all the support and the permission of the state government. It's a state government that calls the shots in all these municipal bonds. If you notice the pride with which the UP chief minister went to ring the bill in BSE, nobody noticed, nobody saw the mayor of the municipal corporation or the chief executive officer. It was the CM show all the way. It is basically the intent of the state government that sets everything. So any municipal borrowing needs the support and the permission first of the state government. And then it needs to keep in mind the SEBI guidelines. And then there is this PFDF guidelines. There is a pool fund development fund scheme. And the whole purpose of that scheme is to be able to fund the credit enhancement required to take a high safety rating. We did a study of all the municipal bonds that have been issued so far. About 53 billion bonds have been issued so far, and 75% of them achieved high safety rating. It is the norm in India because high safety is the threshold rating for investment by provident funds. So no municipality goes into the market without a high safety rating. So it is almost a done thing that you credit enhance it so much. In fact, some of these credit enhancements are so strict that you wonder why municipalities would go to the bond markets at all. Look at the escrow account where the interest payments are brought in advance, and look at the principal payments that are brought in advance, and then there is a government support and the budgetary support for them, and then there's a multilateral agency which is sort of giving a guarantee for 50% of the bond issue. And with all these credit enhancements to go into the market, look at the cost of the issue. It is so much easier for a municipality to just demand it as a grant from the state government or go for a bank loan, which is cheaper. Today, the government of India has to actually incentivize the corporation to go for a bond issue, and I'll pay you a certain percentage for every 100 crore bond issue, and that sort of you reduce from the interest costs and say, no, I raise it at a cost effective way. But I'm just making the point that these things are very hugely complex for the municipal issuers, because they don't have even the capacity to close their accounts properly. If you look at a budget document of a small town, it is filled with mistakes, including totaling mistakes. So we're talking about a limited capacity and the huge dependence on the state, all these structures for them. Now, is there enough incentive for the state governments to do so? Now there is, because state governments themselves are running a huge debts on their balance sheets, that they do want the municipalities to go into the market by themselves, become more self-reliant, and many of them are getting their books and accounts together, looking at ways of strengthening municipalities. Does a pool fund work? Of course, there is a need for the small municipalities to come into the market for funds. Pool funds is one of the way to do it. And a sector-specific fund, yes, it would work. If you look at the bonds that have been raised so far in the Indian market, more than 51% of it was for water and sanitation, right? A small percentage came for roads. So it will make eminent sense to have some kind of a central policy towards water supply and sanitation funds, if that will help the rollout of the this pool fund structures. Have there been any defaults in the past? No. I mean, with all these credit enhancement, honestly, I mean, do we expect a default? It's sort of choked to the brim. In fact, I think it would be a good idea to let the municipalities go like that, with a simple standalone rating and some amount of credit enhancement. The market is already scrutinized the bond issue so much and build so many layers of credit enhancement that there is no default as such on these bonds. With government bonds, they have in the past, I'm not talking about these structures or municipal bonds, they have been defaults in the past with some of the state government bonds too, but these are more like delays in payments. And because these bonds are held to maturity, they are not talked about. But these sort of issues with these many layers of credit enhancement do not see defaults.
Thank you, Lakshmi. Thank you so much for that wonderful insight into municipal bond market. Madhav, now, Madhav, can you hear me, Madhav?
Yes.
Madhav, I will now turn to you because one of the key issues that has got a lot of attention during JNURM is that the pace with which most of the projects were planned because of the quality of the DPRs and suffered. Given your experience in most of the urban transport, especially the BRTS, what are some of the pertinent issues in project preparation and development activities? So that kind of impeded the leveraging of the public finance and to attract the market capital. Could you share that?
Yeah, no, thanks, Pavan. And, I'll be brief because I think we are closing to time. And I think, but, simply, I think, I was involved in quite a few of these bus rapid transit projects that sort of came out of JNURM. And there were two things. One was there was very little capacity or understanding of the concept at the time. So their technical capacity was with very few people. And if there was a way in which all the projects could have accessed that capacity, it would have really helped. So one idea was to see if some kind of a specialized project preparation facility with 6 to 8 dedicated experts can get created. And then what happened in JNRM and is like every city was to submit DPR on sort of day 32 or whatever from this launch. And this is, I think, so then Ashwin also spoke about it. They weren't necessarily then all well prepared, right? The time that required to prepare these projects wasn't there. So some kind of this pipeline of projects idea, and since we've been sort of launching new urban programs with the gov every 5 years or so, I think this whole pipeline of projects ideas doesn't seem to have happened. So I think for me, I think in a way, I think what is the sort of facility or institution that you create is one is, but I think it's very clear, and especially now with sort of advancement in technology, even on water projects and things like that, now you're seeing the use of robotics. We've seen such a big use of technology in transport projects. So the fact that there is some expertise that can guide on sort of technology adoption, project design, finance design, whether it's water, sewerage, sanitation. So where you create it, I don't care, but I think some technical capacity and has to be created that can be accessed for each of these projects. The second is that to take the time to build these projects, right? So if it takes 9 to 12 months to prepare a project, I think it needs to be taken. And then so the whole idea is then can we find a way or to start creating a pipeline so that whenever a facility, sort of financing facility gets set up, etc., 4 or 5 projects or 8, 10 projects are always ready, and some annual 1 year or 3 year cycle sort of happens. So this is something, and it's very evident. I mean, I think that's the thing about the Pro-Trump program that Carlos shared with us is how and what is even more interesting is actually they're taking surplus from toll roads and putting it for sustainable transport. So I think on both counts, I think it's an interesting example to and how they've created the pipeline, and then have over the years now funded 50 projects. But if you look at they've done 4 or 5 projects a year probably. And so I mean, again, and that's the sort of question that what would work best, I mean, at the state level, at the national level, and I mean, and as a next round of an urban infrastructure program. Right now today we have the smart cities program and then Amrut. So I don't know if there is a way to create some kind of urban infrastructure program that then sort of helps this kind of you prepare these kinds of facilities kind of a thing. There, I mean, and there have been talks of a green transport fund as a pooled finance fund. There have been some conversations. KfW, others have also expressed interest. So I mean, and so again, the hope is that, that could probably be designed like this also, as a pool finance fund with an attached project preparation facility. So anyway, those are just my thoughts, but I mean, uh, and since we are close to time, I don't know if there are questions, but I don't know if maybe we can take a few minutes and see if maybe any of the panelists have questions for each other as well. But I mean, I do think, and based on what Lakshmi said or what Ashwin said, I mean, clearly there is a demand, and I don't know what is how to make the policy push, and maybe some additional conversations like this on both sort of project preparation facilities, and CDI was one model, and some kind of a pool finance facility to then support those projects, which the program is an example. So uh, and so any thoughts also with the audience or any of the panelists on that, on how we push this agenda? So I mean, Ashwin, I know I asked you this question, but anybody else, if you have any thoughts on that, and I don't know, Radhika or Kirtiba, you'll have to let us know how much over we can go. We were supposed to be till 7 o'clock. We are already at time. So yeah. So
One
that's,
of the things, Madhav, that because in Chennai we are now looking at our next master plan that is coming up. Things are a few years down the line, but we're already talking about it. I wonder if you could tie some of this project preparation to the master plan preparation, because that happens periodically. So we somehow able to sort of infuse this thinking. So when you have the master plan, you have the shelf of projects along with it, rather than just a master plan with land use and zoning and so on. That might be one way to dovetail, because I found, as we all know, creating a completely new process is difficult. Using an existing process and trying to piggyback on it is probably easier. So that might be one thought of institutionalizing. I see a comment from Sriram Veeraraghavan on the chat, and I mean, sort of also what I was saying, which is once you have a shelf of projects, it works.
So your one suggestion is sort of linking certain strategic projects or coming up with a strategic plan in parallel to the land use master plan, so that
Yeah.
yeah, no, that's a valid interest. There are a few questions in the chat as well. So maybe Pavan, just let's look at all of the questions. But meanwhile, I don't know if you have any questions to each other, or some thoughts on the conversation. Maybe we can.
Yes, can I say a few words?
Please.
This is Emiel here. Over the years, I guess my notion of the need to link capacity development to project preparation has become more pronounced, because it's very clear, working with the local governments through Asia, including in India, that there is lack of capacity to do the things that you would expect them to do, and to basically, by whatever means, develop a pipeline of fundable projects eventually. So to me, that was the most binding constraint that impinged on the whole system, and I'm sure that was not just in India, but it was all over. So if you're talking in terms of setting up a new facility, I would say link it closely to capacity development in some shape or form. How you can link it, for instance, to the system of university education system that you have, is an issue, because you can't do everything in a standalone facility like CDIA.
Thank
you. I want also to make some comment.
Please, Carlos, please.
Yes, what we have found that it's very helpful is that for one point is to create a group of specialized companies, consultant companies, that they help the subnational governments for this planning and feasibility stage. But which is not enough, but it helps a lot to create this specialized consultant companies. Then the other aspect which is important is to create in the case of transport, it could be applied in water supply and in other facility needs, is to create a specialized authority to implement the transport strategy or the transport plans, what you call it capacity building. And linked to that, what's happening in Mexico is that these subnational authorities have been organized in an association where they meet frequently and they share best practices and lessons learned from their errors, which will help and induce a generation of conscience of developing sustainable projects. I mean, in different areas, not just in transport. And I think these two elements, I think, will lead to promote, to advance in the right direction, and to learn of the experience of the different projects that are implemented. Thank you.
And what is this, Carlos? Can you mention what it is called? This association or of government?
For instance, in Latin America, they built the association of all the entities engaged to create these BRT systems. So the organizers, they join in a Latin American organization. But in Mexico, they form something similar between the different state authorities, urban transport state authorities, and the leaders of each of these authorities. They form an association. And so they keep building a database, and they meet them every 3 months. They make their presentations and they share the experience. And so this is helping in order to, in a sense, to compete between the different states to be implementing their different projects. I can send you the name of the association.
Thank you.
And the contact.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Any other final thoughts, Lakshmi, or then maybe we can hand over to Kirti Saab to close. Pavan?
Let me make one more point,
Sure.
if I may. One of the features in CDIA that I was really happy with, and I still is relevant today, is the fact that it was application-based. It was not a given grant, but local governments had to apply for support and had to argue, fill out a rather detailed form that explained why they want assistance in a particular area. That helped enormously to sort of separate the serious from the non-serious local governments. It was, in a way, if you like, a rationing mechanism under conditions of extreme scarcity, because the needs are enormous for this infrastructure, as I think is illustrated by everybody. But at the same time, there's only so much money to go around to prepare projects. And yet, at the same time, it is precisely the preparation of these projects that was a key, because that's where the constraints are. So to set up a demand mechanism, a demand-driven mechanism, was very good in my perception.
I agree with Emiel. I think that's an important message of his presentation, is to link planning with finance. This linkage to finance is crucial, because there are a lot of studies of plans which are never implemented. If they are not linked to the financial constraints and the financial feasibility, then the project is not implemented.
Thank you. Pavan, any thoughts, or shall we give it to Kirti Bhai to close?
Yeah, Madhav, I think there are a couple of questions.
Yeah, what is the time like, Pavan?
It's 7:11.
Yeah, we can go up to 7:30. Please go ahead.
Okay, okay. So I will just read out the question that's were posted on the chat box. One is, bonds are considered as suitable instruments to promote some fiscal discipline. ULBs need not always look for liberal grant or soft loan funding, which leads to not a demand-driven approach, but just putting the projects of convenience on the public. That may result in wasting of public assets and public money as well. So that was I don't know if it's a question or it's just a comment. Second is, are the pooled funding and other funding projects leading to funds chasing the project scenario, which may not be demand-driven approach? That's the question. Third is, traditionally pool of projects are prepared first, then funding is sought. Is that correct, or we should put projects with funding on board and then you will be stake them? Ashwin, would you like to be?
Sorry, Pavan, did you ask me?
Yes, Ashwin. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I was just responding, to that last question. I believe clearly the projects need to be prepared first. Otherwise, you find it difficult getting money at the best of times, and when you don't have a project, it's even more difficult. But I think the point is, and I think Madhav was also saying this takes time, right? This is not something that you do in a month and a half. There are many DPRs that I've seen that have been prepared very hastily, where the numbers are wrong. And then only when you actually start implementing, you find that your costs have gone haywire and that carefully built financial model just doesn't work. So it takes some time. And I think that's where, we need to invest that time up front. Which is the missing sort of part, because for whatever reason, lack of capacity, election cycles, fragmentation in government, becomes difficult to systematically come up with a program and say, okay, over the next 2 years, I'm going to develop these shelf of projects. People have tried. It's happened in certain cases. I think in the case of roads, some governments did a relatively good job of having a shelf of road projects that they then tried to bring out for PPPs, etc. But at the more municipal level, and these were state highways and kinds of things. But at the municipal level, this has sort of been lacking, partly, I suppose, also because of capacity. Yeah, Gujarat, I think, was a state that at one point of time had a good shelf of projects, primarily on the larger infrastructure side, not so much on the municipal urban side.
Thank you, Ashwin. I think this question may be for Lakshmi. The question is, aren't the structural issues key to the problem of raising funds? So you have state government departments, multiple departments addressing each sector. Then there are local bodies with no power or control over their revenues. And then there are parastatals trying to help in raising funds. Multiple ones, in fact, create enough confusion.
Yeah, they do create confusion, but different entities have raised funds. For instance, the GHMC raised it for road product. For project, and Huda had raised its money for the ORR project. This is his grand roads, ring roads outside the city. That was built by Huda with the Japanese loan. And there's a Hyderabad Water Supply and Sewerage Board, which went and made its own issue of bonds. But the larger point that you make is that should a GHMC be spending so much money on roads when the citizens are not getting water supply or sanitation done? And because HWSSB is in such a financially weak situation, it is not able to function properly. So it is more important for a state government to take a holistic approach that, let us look at the corporation and the Water Supply and Sewerage Board and the Urban Development Authority together have some kind of a project for the entire city, and then come up with a funding plan and say, this much will be raised for roads and this much for water supply. Not when you leave it to each institution, then it depends on who's heading the institution. Sometimes you have a dynamic commissioner of a corporation, so he's making his point more assertively in front of the chief minister and the other ministers. He gets away with the project. So it is more important to take a holistic picture. But in India, this has not come in the way of people going into the bond markets on their own too.
Thank you, Lakshmi. Kirti Bhai, I think.
Kirti Bhai, over to you to close.
Yeah, over to you to close.
No, thank you very much. Thank you, Madhav. And thank you, Pavan, and thank you, WRI, for helping to organize this webinar. I know it took a long time. We've been working on it for now 3 or 4 months, and finally it is in place. So we are extremely delighted, and thank you very much. Thanks also, Pavan and Madhav, for very skillful and very effective moderation of this webinar. Thanks obviously are due to the very distinguished panel, Lakshmi Krishnamurthi, Emiel, Wegelin, Ashwin Saab, Carlos. Thank you very much for your very thoughtful and very enlightening sort of presentation. Before we thank, I must announce for those who are present here that our next webinar, which is 37th in the series, takes place on 22nd December, and that is on municipal governance, role of the elected representatives and the executive, and that will be anchored by Shri Tikender Panwa, who was the past deputy municipal commissioner, deputy mayor of Shimla Municipal Corporation. And before we end this, I must thank a colleague in studio, INHAF, who have been working behind the scene and making this thing work. So thank you, Radhika, Shimul, Elika, Nitin, and Anita, and Dr. Hariharan. Thank you very much. So we end this webinar, and thank you. Very useful. Learned a lot. Of course, there is so much to take home, and there is so much to do. Thank you. Thank you, Madhav.
No, and thank you to all of you speakers for joining us.
No, thank you. I've been after you, and I know it's not easy. It takes time. And Pavan was exceedingly helpful. So thank you very much.
Thank you all. Very
Kirti, thank you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ashwin. Thank you very much. Carlos, thank you very much. It was a very clean presentation.
Thank you, Kitty. Thank you to all.
I have a very close friend in Mexico. I don't know whether you know that. Enrique Ortiz of Habitat International Coalition.
Oh, yes. I know him very well. He's an architect.
Yes, and I think I was the president of HIC and he was the secretary general. So we have been close together, working for a long time. So thank you. It was very delightful presentation. I liked your slide, quality of the slide. Simple, beautifully done. And of course, the whole presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kirti. Thank you to all of you of this opportunity to express some ideas.
And thank you for the early morning.
Early morning, yeah.
6 a.m.
Early morning. The sun is coming up now.
Pavan, your slides were very beautiful, very informative, very well, very nice. Madhav, you cut 2 or 3 of them, or I think all of them were presented.
No, he cut a couple of slides.
Very nice. But they're all there in the presentation, right?
Yeah, they're all in the presentation.
It's mainly on the state funds, which then Ashwin did explain in detail. So that was
so you didn't miss anything, Kirti, to that extent.
Oh, I think that's very good. And I'm of course sorry that I think Mr. Rao from NITI Aayog couldn't join. I don't know what happened.
No, I think they had. So his office told me that they had a meeting with Amitabh Khan till 6:30 or 7.
No, because I was looking forward to. I think they're coming, and I think this is their subject, and there's so much of thinking that we were sharing, and I'm sure they would have gained a lot, and of course we would have learned a lot from them as well. So it's a loss in that sense, and I'll try and write to. What I'll do is I'll send recording of this webinar to NITI Aayog for whatever is worth. I think we do that. Thank you.
Yeah, great.
Lakshmi ji, thank you very much. It was very technical for me. I think I'm an architect and don't understand money very much, but looked very, very good. Thank you.
She's left, Kirti.
She left Kirti.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Anyway, thank you again, Carlos.
Thank
Bye.
you, Madhav. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye. Bye.
Bye, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, Ashwin. Thank you so
Bye-bye,
much.
Pavan.
Yeah,
Bye,
Thank you,
everybody.
bye.
Won't
Thank
see
you.
you here
And
in
thank you,
Washington,
Emiel.
Carlos. Otherwise, we
See.
are in Washington
Emiel, are you there?
every year. So.
Emiel left Kirti.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you all. We are closing the session now.
Thanks, Radhika. Thank you.
Radhika ji, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Elika, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Very nice. Thank you. Very well done. Very, very successful. Very useful one. Thank you.